Welcome everyone to the closing session of the first day of our AHNS CASA meeting. This last panel, I think, is really going to be an extraordinary group of people discussing a truly important topic. We've asked Samir Khariwala to chair this panel. Samir is a professor and vice chair in the Department of Otolaryngology, Head and Neck Surgery, as well as the chief in the Division of Head and Neck Surgery at the University of Minnesota. Samir also serves as the chair of the publication and awards service within the AHNS. I couldn't think of a more ideal person to moderate this session. And he has brought together a truly impressive and understanding group of individuals to talk about the role of publishing during this pandemic. Samir?
Thank you, and thanks Dr. Nance and Dr. Deschler for the program you put together and for inviting us to present on this topic. The title of this session is Publishing in the COVID Era, Did We Over or Under Compensate? And certainly, as you've heard in the other sessions today, from multiple perspectives, everything that we encountered related to COVID was, of course, unprecedented. And adding to that, or another aspect of that, has been how to handle data and publishing in that environment. Again, something that we've never had to address. So we've assembled a panel of representative folks from editorial boards in several journals relating to otolaryngology, head and neck surgery, and assembled them to create a panel here. So I just want to introduce the panel quickly. Representing oral oncology, we have Dr. Carole Fakhry from Johns Hopkins, Bob Ferris from the University of Pittsburgh, representing oral oncology, from Laryngoscope Investigative Oral Otolaryngology, Dr. Cherie-Ann Nathan from LSU. Representing JAMA Oto, both myself and Louise Davies, who also serves on the editorial board. Louise is out of Dartmouth and the VA at Wright River Junction in Vermont. And representing the annals of otology, rhinology, and laryngology is Nitin Pagedar from the University of Iowa. And last but not least, representing head and neck is Ehab Hanna from MD Anderson Cancer Center. So thank you all for participating in this panel. Prior to putting this together, we kind of put our heads together and tried to gather a little bit of data about what each journal's sort of experience was during the pandemic. And this slide kind of collates that as much as possible into one slide. And so I kind of want to start with some of the data that we presented here. So on the left, you'll see the different journals, and on top, a couple different questions. And the first question we asked was, what was the percent change in submissions between March and December of 2020 versus prior years? And you'll see there in the left most column, all the journals experienced a significant increase in submissions. And when you look at the next column, what proportion of all the submissions in 2020 were COVID submissions? That number is not quite as high, but it's still significant. A notable proportion of these papers were COVID related. So I wanted to start by asking the panelists, what was, how did you manage this, and how do you react to this, seeing these numbers, given your experiences, in COVID, and how did you sort of deal with this rush of new submissions? There are certainly theories that, on the one hand, of course, it was COVID-related data that people were trying to get out. On the other hand, a lot of people were at home and maybe had more time to finish up papers. So I'm curious as to the panelists' perspective on that and how they manage that. Why don't we start with Dr. Nathan?
So, I think you mentioned that people were home and had more time to publish, but in the same vein, we also had people who were really willing to review articles that came in. So for LIO, for instance, the overall days to final decision is typically 88 days. The COVID papers days to final decision was 49. Overall days to the first decision on these manuscripts most often was 39 days, but for the COVID papers and during that time, 26 days. And the exception rate was 75% for COVID papers, and for regular papers, 65%. So I think we actually did pretty well because we had people at home who were willing to review and was reviewed in a more timely fashion.
Dr. Hanna, what are your thoughts about this data?
Thank you, Samir. I think this data really highlights what we all experienced, which is an incredible body of information that was evolving as the pandemic was taking shape. The issues that we were dealing with at that time were actually pretty germane to everyday practice. Things like, PPEs and testing, and how do you triage cancer cases? And what are the risks to the otolaryngologist? What are best practices? So a couple of things that I would say from the head and neck journal perspective. One is we were sort of seeing a conglomerate of these categories of papers being sent for submission at a very high rate and early in the pandemic. Parallel to that, there was a need beyond the borders of our country for information. And we are very blessed here, you know, with the CDC, the NIH, our academy, the American Academy of Otolaryngology, a lot of our specialty societies, especially head and neck and rhinology, were circulating an incredible amount of pertinent and timely information. A lot of that information had to do with safety of the healthcare providers on the front line, and also trying to get the best knowledge around regarding management of the airway and the COVID positive patients, in addition to, again, the issues of testing and PPE. So we felt in head and neck that while we are blessed with that type of information here in the United States, there was a paucity of this access in countries that maybe were less fortunate. So we made a decision to go to the publisher and put a dedicated one issue, and it ended up being 2 issues in a very timely fashion that would be full download, free of charge globally. And the publisher actually saw the benefit of that and they agreed to it. So, you know, perhaps unlike some of the other journals listed on this slide, we intentionally fast-tracked a lot of that and put it together online because we wanted to get the information out as soon as possible. And one of the things that stands out to me in this slide, and I didn't know it until we put this panel together, and I thank you for that, is the decision time, the turnaround time. And head and neck, it was 15% of the same time for non-COVID patients. In other words, it was 85% faster to get a COVID manuscript in head and neck. And that's probably reflected because we wanted to get these 2 issues out back to back in April, early in the pandemic. And of course, you know, the quality issues and the review issues will come in subsequent discussions. So, but that's kind of what the numbers tell me in terms of how does head and neck compare to the others and why.
Now, did you feel that, you know, certainly for head and neck, that last column there is really dramatic, much faster review and, you know, decision for papers that were COVID related. Did you find, or did your editorial staff find, and I'm curious as to the whole panel's opinion on this, that some of that was due to the fact that you were getting a lot of things that just weren't suitable for publication and therefore a decision could be rendered more quickly, or that you had really dedicated a, you know, significant effort towards getting these COVID papers addressed quickly and, you know, into the publishing sort of machinery?
Right. So great question. And the answer is yes and yes. So we did get a lot, I wouldn't say bad papers or low quality papers, but we did get a fair amount of duplication of the same type of studies. And we just had to choose the most meritorious. And it had to do with, you know, where the papers were coming from. Now, remember, this was, again, April. So I mean, I think as the experience in China and in South Korea and in Singapore were maturing, and in Hong Kong as well, and then in Italy, they were really faced with the first big surge in Europe. These countries provided sort of a first snapshot of what otolaryngology looks like in the peak of a pandemic. And then, of course, you know, some of the surgical issues and the testing issues that we alluded to. So if you had, you know, a mature experience of several hundred patients compared to a preliminary experience of 20 or 30 patients, and they're both saying the same thing, obviously the more robust or highly powered study got ahead. But the second part of the question is the process itself, because we needed to get these two dedicated issues out. The review process was truncated into the editor-in-chief, the associate editors, and the first responding reviewer or two. And we didn't have sort of like, you know, let's wait for another reviewer and let's give them another week and that kind of thing. I, as editor-in-chief, actually stepped in and reviewed a lot of papers myself. And the associate editor team and the editorial board team that I have in AHNS is truly outstanding, and they were phenomenal in their turnaround time, given what we were trying to accomplish, which is basically make critical information, life-saving information available worldwide in a timely fashion, free of charge.
Thank you. So Doctors Ferris and Doctors Ferris and Fakhry, you know, from the oral oncology perspective, you also sort of achieved a significant reduction in time for you know, COVID papers compared to non-COVID papers. So I'm curious as to your perspective on that. In addition, this third column, percentage of letters and editorials among those COVID papers, you had a significant amount of the submissions coming in that were letters and editorials. And this was, you know, a lot of what was coming out initially during the pandemic, because we were all sort of learning on the fly and creating perspectives, not necessarily always with data. So number one, I'm curious as to, you know, your thoughts on what Dr. Hanna just talked about and reducing review time. But also, how did you manage and know which of these letters, or determine which of these letters and editorials were most meritorious for publication in your journal?
Well, I can start, and certainly Carole, she has, of course, is a head and neck surgeon and a population scientist, epidemiologist, can comment on some of the papers where that expertise was valuable. My practice as the editor-in-chief is to triage, and as Ehab mentioned, and similarly, I handle all of the letters for the most part myself. I don't tend to send those out for review. So as with most statistics, if you look at one number, that would not necessarily incorporate what we did in March and April when everything was new. Many of them came, as Ehab said, from Italy or some in New York, although I think our colleagues in New York were working so darn hard they didn't have time to write. I don't know how the Italians did, but they submitted a lot of stuff. And, you know, around that time, a lot more letters, and I handle those myself. So of course, that's going to reduce the time, and they go online for oral oncology very rapidly. And so that counts as published. Many of them at that point were also less, I'd say, scientific. They were more, as we used to think about, the laryngoscope had the how I do it. And I would say a lot of those were small case series, the how I do it, ways to manage a diagnostic laryngoscopy to stage a head and neck cancer, how to manage a tracheostomy. And there was a period there where I think those letters were quite informative, and then they became quite repetitive. And so the letters then really got editorially rejected with a note that, you know, at that point we were all doing those sort of things. And then I think our stringency increased, and we expected an actual study, you know, information. And so, I think that was what began to happen over the summer as there was adequate databases being kept. People began to ask specific questions and compare one approach to another, as opposed to sort of anecdotally mentioning how they had accommodated this influx of patients into their sites of high exposure of their population. It began to have more prognostic data as we had longer term experience with COVID and head and neck cancer, or asking the question, should we put off surgical treatment and give some induction chemotherapy for a cycle or 2 or 3? And those sort of things became secondary and potentially tertiary type publications. I then started to notice that authors often were duplicating, and so our stringency also elevated so that people were not slicing and dicing the same experience. One paper on doing laryngoscopies and the other on tracheostomies, but the same 30 or 50 patients. But if there was information, I think a letter is a quick way to get that transmitted and get that out there quickly. And so that's why we did so when it was novel, and then the stringency really went up. And I would say if you asked us the first 3 to 6 months versus the last 3 to 6 months, I would say it became almost a guaranteed attraction to have a COVID in the title. And now I find it almost to be a detriment, where it's almost a negative in my mind, because I think we've sort of seen it and heard it, at this point, at least in the head and neck oncology field. I haven't seen a lot of new data come out, I have to say, in some of these more recent publications. But Carole may have other comments to add with regard to oral oncology.
Yeah, I think in general, if we step back and think about our roles in getting papers out and our service roles on journals, it's really to get information out and to transmit information quickly. And so I think, the way that it was handled, oral oncology, to have it all in letters and editorial, because we couldn't really, it wasn't data, and it was just personal experience, and it was a means of communicating that. And now I think it's shifted to much more data, and so we could evaluate it through the usual editorial process and review process.
So that gets to another question, which I'd like to pose, I guess, first to Dr. Davies. There's this duality of our periodicals where we are, scientific peer-reviewed journals, but also kind of, on the other end of the spectrum, newspaper-ish. We're there to get out information. And how do we manage that, now looking back? Did we venture far enough into, the newspaper-ish sort of side of things, or not far enough? Because certainly things were changing every day, and data was coming out in various outlets, whether it's mass media or scientific publications. What do you think, Dr. Davies? How did we do, and what is our role, moving forward, if and when this happens again? How do we manage that dual nature of our mission?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I felt like it was an uncomfortable place to be, right? We're not really used to being a newspaper, essentially, right? We're used to a more thoughtful approach to peer review. But as Dr. Fakhry was saying, there was just this urgency of need to transmit information. And so, we did, although, the JAMA parent family was very concerned about putting out things that we might need to retract later. And this was always a tension. And so I think we erred on the side of caution. I actually remember having a conversation with Dr. Piccirillo where he said, somebody's writing to me about loss of sense of smell. Like, what is that? Like, this is very early on. And, there was just this sense of not being sure of, like, is this important? Is this really going to be and is this the right thing to put out? I think, it took so long to get things into the print journals. The white journal was able to put things out online, and at JAMA OTA we put out something very fast that we put together with a group with the help of folks at San Francisco who'd really done a lot of the research. I think if I had it to do again, I would think about being more explicit about using maybe a specific mechanism that we developed of observations and early reflections so that it would feel a little bit more systematic. There was another sort of interesting thing that happened, which is that we got a lot of perspective pieces that were unprocessed emotion, essentially. And they were great, but they needed more time to mature and reflect. And so we had to send them back and say, like, you need more time to think this through. Hopefully they'll resubmit them, or I suppose they might send them somewhere else and we missed it. But that was an interesting aspect of the experience.
Thank you. I just wanted to move to another slide here. Dr. Fakhry was kind enough to pull this data. Dr. Ferris kind of touched on this, that you start to get the sense at some point that things are getting repetitive as you're seeing these submissions come in. And so just doing a PubMed search, she came up with, a few topics there were a lot of papers on some of these topics: how to manage trachs, what to do about delays in managing head and neck cancer, what constitutes an AGP, what's the significant event of anosmia, as Dr. Davies just mentioned. So Dr. Pagedar, how did you sort of process this over time? I think initially, we probably had to take everything in and take it seriously, consider it, what's its value. But over time, these things started to become, well, is this one adding any more to the prior paper? How did you manage, your submissions and also keeping up with the literature to see if what you're getting is really novel and additive?
Yeah, that's a great question. You can look at this slide, it feels like a fire hose of just stuff. And as I think Bob and Louise have described, there's a question about whether some of these things are, I like that Louise's phrase of unprocessed emotion for some of these letters, and just repetitive, like, what does this add to the one before it? I think that as our experience was the same as was what Bob described with oral oncology. I think that in the beginning there was some novelty that really needs to get out into the world, and for people to hear what other people are seeing. But eventually, I think we need to expect data. I think that observations are one thing, but data is a different thing. And I think our standards necessarily changed over the course of 2020 and into early 2021. That it is, at some point it was enough to say, here's 2 patients with laryngectomy that were admitted with COVID-19. But eventually it's systematically, what can we really learn? What is generalized knowledge? I think our role here has changed over the last 12 months in terms of what the journals can add to the situation. And I think this really brings that home.
Okay. So I guess the question I would pose to the full panel, I'm just going to unshare these slides here, is, if and when this happens again, how would we change, would we change our approach, or what would we do differently, having been through this, once now, and how would we change the way we either triage articles, process articles, solicit articles, have articles reviewed, etc.?
Well,
Dr. Hanna, go ahead. Oh, go ahead, Bob.
Well, I was actually going to just congratulate and compliment Ehab for doing that focused issue. I think that's a great idea. And, perhaps we could even think about taking such a step, beyond that, is to sort of publicly let people know that there will be a period for whether that's a month or some period, and that the best or whatever most novel ones would be collated, and then the standard would change to be a little bit more overt. I actually saw some people get quite disappointed 6 months in for writing a relatively banal, quite obvious paper of essentially what all of us here on the call were doing already at that point, and feeling like it should be accepted, and they were quite surprised. So maybe just to let them know the course ahead, and to focus it as Ehab did is a nice issue, so everyone has it in one place.
Thank you, Bob. I think that the question is, what would we do different next time? And it really depends on what that next time looks like. This time around, a lot of what you're hearing from the editors is this tension about shifting our MO from strict and rigorous scientific review for strict and rigorous scientific methodology into sort of dissemination of early, rather immature information. And that is a palpable tension when you are dealing with something so novel that nobody knew anything about, yet so detrimental to individual patients, health systems, and frontline providers. So there is something that goes here beyond sort of what we're dealing with as editors with the scientific methodology and the merits of the paper, to shifting gears into, as you've heard before, information sharing. So if the next time around is something as novel, I think we will be less uncomfortable shifting gears into that mode. So I think that's the first observation. The second observation is that sometimes these early reports can serve in one of two very valuable ways. One is hypothesis generation. A lot of the best knowledge we have about some of the most important diseases we treat started as observational, either by a case report. The whole HPV started by a case report of a couple transmitting the disease to each other. And here we are. And that was published in a very reputable journal, and it was a single case report. But the flip side of this anecdotal sort of immature knowledge is, in a situation such as this global pandemic, it has to do with the sharing of information may actually be life-saving in a lot of ways. So for example, I'll give you my personal sort of value of reading some of those earlier reports. The first time I've heard about the risk to otolaryngology was, as many of you, through the Stanford group, starting almost a blog or sort of a series of emails going back and forth among some of the leaders in this specialty. And you all have experienced the same thing. We were getting 20 or 30 of those a day. And that sort of alerted societies and organized institutions to put together some sort of profile to what is the real risk of AGPs to the otolaryngologist. And then there were some earlier reports. Some of those papers that we all struggled with early on, are these vetted? Is that robust enough? Is that statistically significant? And what happened in my hospital is I decided that we really need to test every patient going through a major complex head and neck resection, symptomatic or not. And that was so early. And for the hospital administration, that was so far out there, given the limitation in testing that we were experiencing. But I did go to the literature, quotation marks, and pulled out some of these very early reports. And that was the best evidence we can get at the time. And it was because of that that my institution actually listened. And we've decided that that's going to be our practice moving forward. So that was sort of the flip side of what is the value of sharing these early reports as immature as they were at the time. So next time around, I think if we're going to be building the plane as we're flying it, we'll probably do the same thing. And but if not, then we've learned so much about that different approach. And I'll pick up on something I think Bob and Louise and others said, which is perhaps what we need to do next time around is have some sort of parallel lane to our sort of formal scientific review process as well as scientific publication. Perhaps an online only, information sharing platform that would still be cited and such, but perhaps would be distinct from the main body of the journal. It would be dedicated as an information sort of warehouse. The American Head and Neck Society put a blog or a bulletin board. So can we borrow some similar model and our journalists would have a bulletin board for the next challenge around? And my last comment is, if there's another pandemic coming up in the future, I hope by then I'm not going to be the editor-in-chief of anything. And I would be able to quarantine somewhere warm with a beautiful view and some sort of nice drink in my hand.
Thank you. So there's a question on the, from the audience that Dr. Rocco has, it's kind of a comment says slash question. Dr. Nathan, I'm curious how you feel about this given Dr. Hanna's comments, but he says it would be interesting to see how many of these articles are cited in the future and which, if any, rise to the top. And I wonder, do you think that if we look now, 1 year out and see which articles really were the hardest hitting, had the most impact, would that inform your response next time? Or do you think each time is a new thing and, it would be nice to know that, but it may be completely different next time?
Yeah, I mean, I think like Dr. Hanna said, it just depends what the next pandemic looks like. If it's similar, I think this time around will definitely inform us, but it's probably going to be very different. And I think I'm just not as optimistic. I think we'll be starting in some ways based on, what the effects of the next virus, hopefully, like Dr. Hanna said, not in our lifetime. But he did make a comment on, what the Head and Neck Society did, and really hats off to Dr. Deschler and Greg Farwell and a lot of other people who had this online blog and a COVID bulletin. But, many of the journals have actually done that. So Wiley did have an online library, and they gathered relevant preprints in the Wiley Open Research Special Collection to get topics of interest and promote initiatives widely, by email. I mean, they did a great job. They even reached out, to different governments and had reasonable rates to be able to have access to the information. So I think we've learned a lot from, this time around. Open access journals, definitely, there was some advantage because the average download time is obviously shorter, it's cited more often because of open access and availability. So again, I think the journals have done a great job with getting this information out there. One other comment I'd like to really make is there should be a way for us to highlight articles that are retracted, the information changed finally, because it all gets lost in there. And I think it would be nice for us to figure out a way of how do we highlight those articles where the information changed and the practice or standard of care change. For example, flexible scopes. We all stopped doing that, but then we realized it's not as aerosol generating. Palpating the base of the tongue is probably worse than when they cough on you. So, just information like that should be, there should be a way to highlight that change.
Thank you. You touched on something that kind of segues to my next question, which is related to the international community. Certainly, folks in in Italy, for example, experienced things in a heavy way before we did, but I still think a lot of the international community was looking towards our own experience. How do we? You touched on this a little bit just now, but how do we next time, ensure access for people in international country, outside this country, who may want the information but don't have access? Should we have some sort of policy that things that are pandemic related or that come out in a pandemic are just open access? Should we have a special link or something on our webpage? How do we assure that, again, we're serving the common good while also staying within our sort of journal rules and typical policies?
Yeah, I mean, Wiley, like I said, worked with governments to deposit all existing and forthcoming COVID-19 content into PubMed Central and made it easier actually to deposit research into the World Health Organization database. But I'd love to hear others' thoughts on, as journal editors, what could we do to have a system, for all the journals that could reach out to the international community and have access freely available.
So I'll just add to that, since I work with Wiley as well. And I think I alluded that to my previous answer, which is this separate lane. So if you think of your main journal as your highway, if you have a service road that is, or a second lane or a specified lane in the journal that you can open under such circumstances, then it actually solves a lot of the problems we're struggling with here in this panel. One, that special lane may have a different purpose, more newspaperish than scientific reporting. It also may have a separate review process, and it may also have some sort of designation by itself that distinguishes it from the usual submission, and also pricing wise, because if the purpose is to promote the knowledge fast enough in a timely way and in an affordable way to the global community, and you embed that information in your regular journal where people have to subscribe at a premium for it, then you've kind of defeated the purpose of trying to get the word out, if you will. So I think, to me, the biggest lesson learned here is to have a mechanism whereby we are nimble enough to be able to carve out a platform within the usual sort of structure of the journal to adapt in real time to a changing backdrop. And I think the dedication of 2 special issues was probably as close as we can get to that. But moving forward, I mean, I think we should always have that spare extra lane, if you will, that can be opened and closed as the need dictates.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. But I worry that, what I think the value we as journals really bring to not just our readership, but the world is in the curation and the editorial process. And I think the value in that feeder road depends on our ability to maintain traffic on it. It is someone's time to make sure that stuff on there belongs there, and the right things, get onto the interstate. Not to take the analogy one step too far. I mean, without that stuff, it's basically Twitter, and that should remind us why we can't have nice things on the internet.
Yes, and I agree with you totally. And I was not suggesting an immediate posting of whatever comes to anybody's mind, but still go through the editorial process, but perhaps with slightly different rules, given the novelty of the information and the timeliness of the information. So some sort of oversight, but not necessarily sort of, the same way we would handle something completely different in nature and in scope. And I think that it's that tension, is that healthy balance between oversight yet timeliness, and really growing in maturity as the data grows.
Can I make a devil's advocate argument about, every day I get an email from the American Academy of Otolaryngology in this ENT Connect thing, and it's sort of an online place where you can go ask questions and people can respond to each other, and then an email gets sent out every night. And is that good enough? That already exists. Do we have to make something new?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that is one mechanism of sharing information, but there's nothing like an organized, categorical, topical, sort of focused. A blog discussion is sort of all over the map, right? And there's a lot of taking again from Louise's unbridled or immature emotions put into that. But I mean, I have to say, for example, there was a lot of COVID literature everywhere. I mean, not just in otolaryngology, but you couldn't pick up a publication without running into COVID information. But it was nice to have otolaryngology related sort of platforms and even subspecialty. We needed to figure out how to deal with head and neck cancer. Is cancer really elective? And what about all the different modalities? I mean, is TORS the way in or the way out of getting people through this? I mean, is chemoradiation therapy prolonging the treatment? Do we need to do more TORS? Or in contrary, being in the operating room is the riskiest thing you can do. So let's stop TORS altogether and treat everybody with chemoradiation. I mean, these were very pertinent questions, and they were burning questions. They weren't intellectual questions. They were practical questions. And we needed to address that. And while I think a chat room or a blog would be one way to sort of raise the questions, I think an organized, some sort of manuscript with as good of a data as we can get at the time is another way. It's not either or. So they're complementary, I think.
I think you could almost use the journalistic ethics standard. And my husband's a journalist. I don't profess to be a journalist, but there is sort of a standard, right? You say what you know to be true today, and you use journalistic standards, understanding that the information may change. And that may be a lesson we can carry forward, that perhaps we'll need to incorporate that in to make these other channels like Ehab is mentioning. Because I agree with your pushback too. It's really hard.
Well, thanks everybody. I did have a couple more questions, but we're just about out of time, and I do not want to incur the wrath of Dr. Yu, who's coming up next. So why don't we wrap up here? Thanks everybody for this excellent discussion and your expert perspectives and opinions. I think this will always be a challenge when this happens, if it happens again. But it's nice to have this experience and all this discussion to inform how we manage things next time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Samir. Great job. I also want to thank all the panelists personally, because not only did you do a great job articulating the challenges today, but the sheer amount of work that went into managing the information that was being put out, holding it to a standard, trying to get it into the hands of the people that wanted it, your membership, your colleagues who wanted to just take good care of people and take good care of themselves. I think you really did yeoman work here, and often goes unappreciated. And to all of you, I really salute the work you did, and thank you for sharing that with us today.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Samir.
Thank you.